I am a theist. I believe God exists. Not the Christian God, but a more general concept of God not tied to any specific religion. I wanted to test my thinking against a knowledgeable atheist, and I thought Dan Barker would be the ideal person to talk to. Because he's smart, yet not abstrusely intellectual. Because he is a firm atheist, co-president of the country's largest atheist organization. Because he used to be a minister for many years, so he knows how most believers think. And because he's had over 100 formal debates with religionists, so he knows the issues. Dan progressed step by step over the years from Christian to liberal Christian to atheist. I progressed step by step over the years from Christian to liberal Christian to non-Christian theist. So what you'll get here in this debate is not a hostile exchange, but an informative discussion on the question of God's existence from opposing viewpoints. The common assent argument. Most people, most cultures throughout history have believed in God. It's not plausible to think that all these people are wrong. And what would your reaction to that be?
Yeah, I hear that argument a lot, and you're right, it's weak, but it's popular. And I heard it on a radio interview I just did a couple of weeks ago, that the guy was saying that really the burden of proof is on the atheists, because so many people do believe in a God that doesn't it make more sense to just assume that there's some reason why? And you have to nod to that argument. Yeah, there's sort of seems to be a commonality. But there's at least two problems with that, I think. First, I don't think the belief in God is that universal. We hear this idea that all cultures have come up with a religion and a belief in God. In China, there's maybe 1 billion people who, they may have some folklore beliefs, but they actually don't have a belief in a God, in a transcendent being or some kind of a creator. Some of the local areas might believe in some kind of animism, I suppose, or that. So we can question or at least weaken the claim that this belief in God is universal in our species. But even if it were universal, even if it were, you can show that a lot of our beliefs, a lot of our instincts, a lot of the fallacies in our brains that we might share in common to some degree or other, have evolutionary reasons for them. For example, most of us evolved, all of us evolved, to make mistakes of agency, for example. When you hear a rustling in the grass, we assume it's a predator rather than the wind blowing. When I was out shoveling one day, I saw a person behind me and it scared me. It turned out to be the trash bin. Our brains make this mistake. I was walking on the trail once in the woods, and I saw a snake, and I kind of, whoa. And then I got closer, it was a tree root. Mm-hmm. Our brains are kind of hardwired to make mistakes, because it was better for our ancestors to make that mistake than to make the opposite mistake. Right. On average, it's better for us to have this wrong idea in our heads for the survival of our species. So just the fact that we have a particular universal idea in our minds doesn't necessarily mean that it's pointing to a reality. It could be a very useful mistake in our minds. So a belief in a God, if it were universal, could just be one of those fallacies that we inherited from our ancestors for some survival reason.
Yeah, and then the other thing is simply that the truth isn't determined by popularity. If you have a billion Muslims, that doesn't mean the Muslim faith is true. 1 billion Christians doesn't prove the Christian God, or 1 billion atheists wouldn't prove atheism. So common assent, weak argument. Pascal's wager that you might as well believe, otherwise you might go to hell, according to Christian theology. I have a brief summary of that. It only considers the Christian religion. If you don't consider, you have the Muslim religion. If you're a firm Christian, you're not necessarily playing it safe, because the Muslim religion will send you to hell for being a Christian. So there's no way to get around that. And I don't.
Well, you're right. With that kind of thinking, what have you got to lose? You're making a bet, Pascal was saying. then with that kind of thinking, you should pick the religion that has the worst hell in it, because that's what you've got the most to lose. In which case, you should be Muslim, because it has the worst hell. But Pascal's wager we can take off the table before we even start, because it's not an argument for the existence of a God. It's an argument for belief in the existence of a God. It's not an argument for a God. It's just an argument that you're better off believing this. It'd be like believing in the goodness of the king or of the dictator, because you're going to survive better if you praise the king and you praise the dictator. You're better off in that, like in North Korea, for example. So it doesn't mean the king is good, but you're better off believing that the king is good. So it's really not even an argument at all. It's a non-argument.
Right. Agreed.
Okay.
The miracle argument, I'll read it. Miracles attested to by many people prove God exists. I would say there has been no confirmed miracle, and so miracles are not a proof of God. And usually what it is something unusual that people have chosen to interpret as a miracle. And the most common thing would probably be a parent praying for a sick child, and the child recovers, and they think it's a miracle. It's not a miracle. It's just a natural way the body tends to heal. So,
well, because in that example you gave, we know that in most populations of ill people, there are going to be, to some degree or other, a certain percentage of people who spontaneously get better. But what we want to look for is that result better than random chance? Are the people prayed for more apt to survive? And in some cases, some studies we've done show that actually people were less likely to do better, especially if they knew they were being prayed for. Then their blood pressure went up and they got worse.
They knew something was wrong.
So you're right, that is a weak argument.
Because not everybody's common wisdom is that there have been plenty of miracles. The Catholic Church has 60-something confirmed miracles at Lourdes, but Michael Martin's book discusses that. I thought he made a really good point. He picked the best out of those 60 or so and checked those out, and the evidence was very weak. And so if he says if you can dismiss the strongest of them, we can pretty well dismiss the rest of them. Right. All right. The ontological argument. I'll have to read this because this is tricky. If you define God as the greatest thing that can be thought, and God exists only in your mind but not in reality, then that's not the greatest thing that can be thought. God in reality is the greatest thing that can be thought. Therefore, God must exist. Which...
Yeah. that the way you just phrase it is a paraphrase of Anselm, the 12th century thinker. The way he said it was, God is a being than which no greater being can be conceived. If God exists only in conception and not in actuality, then he could be conceived to be greater than he is. It's the same idea. It's like thinking, and in Anselm's own day, a guy named
Canelo or something?
Yeah, I forget his name. I wrote an article about it. Said, well, you could fill in the blank. An island that is greater than no other island could possibly exist, and therefore there must be a perfect island somewhere.
Yeah, I refute that by thinking of hell. Hell, if you define hell as the worst possible place imaginable, hell in your mind only is not the worst place. Hell in reality is the worst place. Therefore, hell must exist. Doesn't work.
It's just like trying to pull a rabbit out of the hat, trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps using just words.
Yeah.
It's an interesting intellectual exercise, but I don't think it gets us to a God.
In his debates, Dan sometimes uses what he calls the Fang argument against God, the free will argument against God. If God is omnipotent and has free will, then he can see what will happen in the future. And if he sees what will happen, then he can't change it. And therefore, he is not omnipotent. So the very concept of God is self-contradictory and incoherent. My response to that is, yeah, in human terms, yeah. But if you define God as a less than supreme being, as a being subservient to the law of non-contradiction, subservient to logic, subservient to nature, subservient to time, and so on, then that's not a valid concept of a supreme being. That's a less than supreme being. And you will invariably conclude there is no God. Dan might say I'm exempting God from the basic restrictions that existence has. And I say, yeah, I am. That's the only concept of God, a supreme being, that makes sense to me. If God created existence, then he is above the restrictions of existence. So in my opinion, exercises in self-contradictory logic, like the Fang argument, do not disprove God. Note that I occasionally add commentary like this in order to make my position more clear. Dan is welcome likewise to add commentary of his own from his perspective at any time. The design argument. The universe can be considered a large, complex machine. Any complex machine needs an intelligent designer to have designed it. It makes sense to posit God as the designer of the universe. If you come across a basketball in the woods or a watch, some intelligence put it there, and the universe is a very large, complex machine, and doesn't it make sense that some intelligent designer designed it?
Yeah. That's probably the strongest argument that I hear in debates, and it resonates well with audiences.
Uh-huh.
Because you think, yeah, you find a watch on the ground, well, who made the watch? But packed into that argument, of course, is the assumption that the universe is a machine. When you use that word machine and you put it to the universe, you're already smuggling in a machine maker, because the universe may not be a machine. Parts of it look like like photosynthesis. When you look at a leaf, you look at how the photon hits and excites the electrons, and then that process of, it's an alchemy actually, converting one thing to another. That looks like a machine, but that's a localized thing, where the laws of entropy with more energy coming in from the sun. But much of the universe looks very much unlike a machine. It looks very chaotic and unorganized and disorganized and unconducive to life. Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, when he talked about that very argument, points out the very simple fact that anything that's designed by a designer is less complex than the designer itself. Anything that can design a watch has to be at least as complex as the watch. So then you have to ask, well, if complexity does require a designer, then what about the complexity of the designer? The mind of a God, if such a thing exists, is functioning and complex, and it has desires and it has purposes. So that mind is also complex. So if it's true that complexity requires a designer, then God needs a God, and that God needs a God, and we get into an infinite regress. So you're not answering anything. You're just answering one mystery with another mystery, whereas natural selection and evolution says, forget all that. Let's start from simplicity and go up, rather than starting here and go higher, where you don't get anywhere. So,
okay, I don't agree with you there. I think that the universe needs an explanation, and if you say God made it, and then you say the problem with saying God made it is who made God, and if I say super God, then you say who made super God, and I say super God. So obviously that gets ridiculous very quickly. However, if you just say the universe is here, that doesn't seem to be an explanation. To me, the most reasonable spot to land on is saying the universe is here and was created by God, and God was self-created. And because God is not a physical thing, God didn't have to have a creator or a maker or a cause. So I've always felt that the who made God argument is not a good argument.
The design argument shoots itself in the foot. It begs the question because it assumes that it just assumes that there's a higher level of complexity without actually giving evidence for it.
I think of it this way: where did the universe come from? It's either three things. It was always here, it came from nothing, or something powerful like God made it.
Or something powerful that's natural, not like a God. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be a God. It's just like saying, you look at a river gorge, look at the Columbia Gorge in Oregon, how gorgeous the gorge is, you know. And we kind of know that 15,000 years ago there was the big glacier that melted. And that gorge exists now, and that gorge had a creator. The creator was a flood. That flood was the creator of the gorge. So that gorge came into existence because of a creator that's not personal. It's an impersonal, natural creator.
Yeah, but then you have an infinite regress of physical causes. And I was talking to one atheist once, and the same issue, and he said it was some sort of energy. But to me, even that doesn't make sense. It's got some sort of live intelligence, I think, has to be behind it all. I mean, this doesn't have to be. I admit you could be right. Maybe the universe was always here, it was created by itself or some other physical force. But I think it just seems more likely that it was created by a great intelligence.
Also, I think we smuggle in some of our conclusions when we make statements like, where did the universe come from? As if it had to come from something in the first place. If you ask, where did God come from, and you say, well, he didn't come from anything, he's self-created, then why can't we say the exact same thing about the universe? The universe didn't come from anywhere. The universe could be, if anything could be self-created, whatever that means, then why could not the universe itself have been
because the universe is physical. And our experience is that physical things need a cause, whereas a non-physical thing like God would not need a creator or come from anything. It's more natural to me to believe that there's some sort of infinitely intelligent creator as opposed to the universe just being infinite.
So sitting up there doing what for infinity? Just some being...
Yeah, I think a very key thing to defining God is you can't define him as a being who lives within our reality. In other words, God doesn't get bored, God isn't here or there, God doesn't need a cause. All these things that we're used to, I don't think would apply to God. And you would say that's pure speculation, but I think that's what makes sense.
No, a lot of people think that. It's not. In fact, what you are saying seems very close to what Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson said. And we like to think that Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine would have wanted to join our group, because they were the pre-Darwinian Enlightenment freethinkers. Before there was a concept of the origin of species and life, it made perfect sense to them, and they were not dummies. They were brilliant men, right? They were the deists of the late 18th century, thinking in the same way you are, thinking it through, and they died with that same idea that you have in your mind. They died thinking that there had to be this impersonal being who's intelligent, who doesn't write Bibles and doesn't do miracles and doesn't answer prayers, obviously, but had to be like the Force or something who started it all. So what you're saying is quite respectable. Even though I don't agree with it, I think what you're saying is quite within the line of free thought. So
yeah.
Because theism, instead of deism, theism is a belief in a personal God.
I'm a theist. I think that we're personal beings, and we must have come from a personal being. I don't see how personal beings like ourselves can have come from physical forces without some intelligence that it originally came from. We're intelligent, we're personal, must have come from something intelligent.
But you do see evolution, that we evolved from non-conscious ancestors. You see that.
I see the necessity for God for that. How do you get intelligence from non-intelligence or life from non-life without some power? Like even we were talking about evolution earlier, I've always felt that I believe in evolution, but I think God is behind it because the better qualified creatures would have the adaptive advantage to progress. But to me, they would only take longer to die out. I still think you need some sort of life force to move the whole thing forward. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that way, except a lot of us feel that there's nothing magical about life or a life force.
Don't you think so? You don't
No.
think? I do. If I scratch my arm doing yard work and it's healed, to me that's amazing and magical.
But you can explain that all through natural processes. There's nothing in our bodies or our brains that doesn't exist out in nature somewhere. There's nothing, vital about it, the vital spark that they have. It's the organization of it. The temptation I think that all of us have, and I think maybe there is more of a universal temptation than the belief in a God, is the temptation to think in dualism, to think that there's matter and then something above matter.
Yeah.
That's the temptation.
Isn't it? That's what I believe in.
Yeah, well, and that's a belief because of this, what I would call an illusion, just like a God is an illusion, this illusion of the brain that there's, agencies or that.
Your friends and loved ones, what are they as human beings? They're not just a collection of molecules, they're spirits, they're a personality of some sort.
My friends and loved ones are a collection of functioning molecules.
My reaction to that statement is that if that's the case, then how can you love them? If that's what they really are. Who the heck can love a collection of molecules? Even well-functioning molecules. That just makes them convenient or useful or pleasant, but not really lovable. I am a dualist. I think life is a constant interplay between the physical and the spiritual. I don't think you can reduce the essence of life to molecules or physical forces. Such a reductionistic, mechanistic view of life, for me, would destroy the meaning of life. We humans would then just be very complex robots. If humans are just collections of molecules, I feel that not only would I be unable to love one of them, but I would also feel free to murder one of them, if it were convenient to me, if molecules is all they are, ultimately. As irrational as Dan thinks it is of me to be a dualist and posit an unseen, immaterial, spiritual world, I feel it's irrational of Dan to reduce life to just functioning molecules and, quote, not anything above that.
If I have a soul in my, let's say there's such a thing as a soul or a spirit or something, right?
Yeah, I think there's a spirit to every person.
Okay, all right. And I might use that word spirit with a lowercase s to mean personality, not something separate from the body. So if you want to think, and you're free to think that, I mean, and a lot of people do, that this functioning is actually a thing, not a description of a function, but it's actually a thing, an object, somehow, then you're free to do that.
Yes.
But until we find any evidence or definition of it, because you probably know from science that in order for anything to exist,
it needs a physical substratum to exist in.
Well, not even that. Not even that. I mean, that's probably true, but that's assuming naturalism. But in order for anything to exist at any level, it has to be measured in some way. You have to measure it to define it, and if there's such a thing as a spirit, whatever it is, instead of just a concept, if there is such a thing, an actual entity, an actual thing called the spirit, which lives on or something, then we need to define it in a way that
you can measure.
That you can measure, because if you can't measure it, how does it differ from nothing at all? That's what we mean by definition. Yeah. To define is to measure.
Yeah, but then how do you measure your love for your kids? How do you measure that? You don't.
Easy. How much time I spend with them, how much money I spend with them, how much how I act toward them, the feelings that I get on certain days. You can measure those things.
Some sort of description, yeah, but it's not really. I just think. See, I am a dualist, and I would even say I'm a Platonist. I think ideas are more real, even though they're not things, they're not physical things, verifiable things, but they're very real things. The spirit of if a person has a spirit of generosity, that's something very real. Well, one thing that comes to mind is the Boston bombing recently, the marathon thing. Yeah. The first game at Fenway, a baseball game, there was a tremendous feeling of unity there. Very powerful. To me, that's real. And it's more real than physical stuff.
But it is real. Feelings are real things.
Okay. And they exist maybe in a parallel dimension?
No, feelings are real experiences of a physical organ called the brain. They're very real things. They're chemical, they're electrical, they're functional. Feelings are, when you get this feeling in your gut because of your brain, or when you're afraid, or when you get goosebumps, or when feelings are they're effective. They're very real parts of a brain.
Okay.
And there's this illusion that happens. Like when I'm playing piano in a jazz combo, 3 or 4 or 5 players, we're playing music, and suddenly the song becomes something bigger than the sum of its parts in our minds. It's like, whoa.
So that's not, to me, that is a great reality.
It is yes, it's a reality within our brains that's not, there is no big capital S song hovering above us.
I would say there is. Not because that's the only way we can describe it is metaphorically, like floating in space. That's the only way you can express it.
So there's a thing called a song that exists.
There's a thing called the powerful musical experience.
Well, okay, you can interpret it that way if you like, but if you can also interpret that same experience in natural, physical, scientific ways, if you can do that, then you don't need the supernatural.
But describing it in scientific ways, I mean, describing a love for somebody in scientific ways, it's like not the same thing.
Why not? Why devalue science? Why say it's less? Why say it's less if you can define it in scientific ways? How does that diminish? Like when I'm playing the song, I can define it as F sharp and a G natural, and there's a minor chord here. I can define it and reduce it, but that doesn't detract from the experience that we're having within our brains, this illusion we have of this song, and we all know it's an illusion, but it's an illusion.
It's reality.
Well, the illusion itself is a reality in our brains, but it's not pointing to anything outside of the brain. You do know that some people imagine all sorts of things. They imagine that they're Napoleon, or they...
Yeah, I used to work with mentally ill people.
Okay, so you wouldn't say that this illusion and feeling that these people are having in their minds is pointing to some real thing out there.
No, but I think love between friends or spouses and family, that is so real, and yet if you describe it in scientific or evolutionary terms, you're sort of like missing the point. I mean, like your musical experiences, that experience is way up there, and to me that's very real, and I don't know,
it is real. I'm not saying it's not real.
Maybe one way of expressing it is that Dan thinks emotional experiences are real, but they don't exist outside of our bodies in and of themselves. And I understand that. I certainly don't think emotional experiences or ghosts or spirits are literally or in any measurable way floating around in the air. And yet, to me, in some way they are. They exist in a non-material other dimension at a different level of reality than the physical.
But if somebody wants to interpret those very real feelings that we have, being at Fenway Park, being at a rock concert, being in a group of people that feel, and we all have this feeling that we're, and we are connected to each other biologically, physically, and chemically,
spiritually.
Yeah, and
so
and the word spirit, even some of us atheists might borrow the word spirit with a lowercase s as a perfectly natural thing. Like I might say, the spirit of Thomas Jefferson is with us today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That doesn't mean his ghost is floating in the room over us. It just means that his ideas, his concepts that are in your brain and my brain, we share them, and then we resonate, and we look at each other and we say, yeah, obviously Thomas Jefferson is not here in any real way, except that his ideas, his writings, his thoughts, his concepts, his legacy. And I could use that word spirit not in some transcendent, spooky way, but in a human way of like we have a shared experience of knowing about Thomas Jefferson, and so metaphorically, yeah, I think it's a reality that exists within our brains, within the natural world, where you might think it's a reality above and beyond the natural world. We're talking about the same reality, but you're interpreting it in a dualistic way, when I would interpret it in a more beautiful, prismatic way. It's like when Isaac Newton got criticized for, like Richard Dawkins says, unweaving the rainbow. Like, oh, now that you explained all the frequencies, you took all the beauty out of it. You took all the... Why couldn't we... Why do we have to know that about the rainbow? Couldn't we just have enjoyed the colors? And now you've reduced it to the scientific, you took all the love and the joy and the excitement of, whereas some of us feel like that doesn't take it away, it adds to it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So you got the physical aspect of a rainbow, but you got the spiritual aspect of a rainbow.
What does spirit mean, though?
Okay, let's see if I can find my definition of spirit, because I know you and most atheists have a problem with the word spirit, because hold on, let me find this, because it's so fuzzy. But even though it's fuzzy, hold on, I'll find this in a minute. Even though it's fuzzy, I think it's real. Spiritual to me means having to do with our deeper emotions or experiences of love, joy, or meaning, through which people feel some connection to a higher power. Maybe spirituality is just having to do with anything that moves us deeply. So that's spiritual. I don't know if you would disagree with that. Some examples are, your feelings towards family members or children. Even a thing like being an honest person, it's a spiritual decision that you're going to be honest instead of dishonest. All these things I think science doesn't really explain well, and to me the thinking dualistically, like there is some spiritual truths to things, explains things better for me, which it doesn't for you. Even though we both, agree that these things happen. I reify them, I guess, in a sense. Not in the sense that they're physically out there, but they're out there somewhere, somehow. I'll give you an example of how I think of it. What if every human being was extinguished? Every intelligent animal or being was extinguished. Would logic still exist? I think logic is out there, sitting in the air somewhere, so to speak. It still exists, and if some other species billions of years later becomes intelligent, that logic will still apply when those critters start thinking. So I think logic platonically exists. So that's how I think of spiritual things.
Well, I disagree. I think if no conscious thinking beings existed, then logic would not exist either, because it's not a thing. And you were honest enough to say that you are reifying things.
Yeah.
And to me, the word logic, just because you have a word for something doesn't mean it's a thing. Just like I said with digestion.
But if every intelligent creature died out, and then a new one started up, logic would apply again. So doesn't logic still exist?
Logic. If there were other creatures who evolved, 6 billion years from now, and they would naturally function in a similar way. It's not that logic is some thing out there that it's like they would also have to digest their food, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
So in the meantime, was digestion existing somewhere in the cosmos?
In a sense, yeah.
Well then that's not saying anything at all. Any word that you have a label for, you could just define as existing, you know what I mean? If you want to do that, fine, but what do you gain from it? What do we actually... if we want to pretend that there's a dualistic reality with spiritual things, but a tree is a tree. Why call a tree God? An emotion is an emotion. Why call an emotion spirit when we actually know that the emotions are explicable in natural terms? Why do we need another word for it?
What is it?
So this idea that this temptation to reify that we all have is powerful, and I think we all do it. And even in our language, it shows up. We use words like love, as if love were a thing. I'm going to go to the store and buy some love. I need more love.
Yet Dan says you can't go to the store and buy some love as though it were a thing. But he also said earlier that love is real and it can be measured in certain ways. And I agree with both those seemingly contradictory statements. Love is not a thing, yet it is a thing. And the only way I can reconcile that is to perceive reality in a dualistic way, with a physical realm and a spiritual realm. Love is not a physical thing, yet it is a real thing of an immaterial nature. I think of God in the same way, as immaterial. He cannot be directly measured or scientifically verified, but to me, he's real. Now, interestingly enough, I happen to have in my possession an actual picture of God. Oh yes, an actual picture of God. Just wanted to get that in as a tribute to my sister's sense of humor. On the question of morality and atheism, I think you would agree, atheism by itself is sort of amoral because it's only saying you don't believe in God. You get your morals basically from the idea of being a humanist, I would say. Because, I mean, an atheist just doesn't believe in God. It doesn't imply this morality or that morality. You're the humanists want to do what's good for most human beings. All right, here's a statement I have about objective morality. On your debates with people, this comes up a lot. Is there an objective morality? I think, in theory, the statement that objective morality cannot exist without God, I think, in theory, that's correct. If God, a supreme being, exists, then he decides, or he, she, it, decides what is moral and what is immoral. But without God, morality is decided by fallible, subjective human beings and therefore cannot be fully objective. But, that's in theory, but in reality, morality is necessarily subjective because even as a theist, we do not, or as theists, do not have unequivocal knowledge of God's existence or what he wants or which God or which scripture. So whether you're an atheist or a theist, the reality is it's very subjective. It's a very relativistic situation, even if God does exist. So I don't know if this argument gets anywhere.
You're right, it doesn't get anywhere. If what you say is true, then God's irrelevant, and we're still
in a sense
tasked with figuring it out on our own, which isn't bad. Also, what you say is true. Atheism is not. Atheism is nothing. It's the absence of theism. That's all it is. Atheism is not a philosophy. Atheism is not a creed. Atheism is not a moral philosophy. You point out, I think rightfully, that most atheists, not all, but most atheists, in order to claim some hold of morality, would look to something like humanism, or perhaps some other moral philosophy.
So I realized very early that atheism is a legitimate way to go. But I see this guy almost every year. And he said to me at one point that he doesn't need a God, some God up there to tell him how to be moral. He looks at life and learns from life how to be moral. Okay? And my response to that is, me too. That's how I learn morality, is by seeing how life works. It's, minimizing harm. That's how you be moral. The only thing is I take it one step further or further back and say, but since God created life, that's actually God telling me how to be moral. Is the way I interpret it.
Well, okay, you can say
You're
that.
say, okay, Mickey.
Well, you can say that. Of course, it's like imposing dualism on a natural world. You can do that if you want, and I don't think anything's gained from it, but there's no harm from it.
We experience meaning. Doesn't some meaning demand the existence of full meaning, like the existence of a branch demands the existence of a tree? Meaning must come from meaning, not just develop out of meaningless molecules and physical forces. Or let me read this. This is a quote from a guy named Hank Hanegraaff, who's a Bible answer man. I don't know if you know him. He writes, are you the product of millions of years of unguided, purposeless processes, with your every choice fatalistically determined by brain chemistry, genetics, and social conditioning? Or are you created in the image of a loving God, a unique individual whose life has eternal meaning and significance? So, it's so hard to pin this down. I know, it's sort of clear to me when I'm on my own, but when I'm sitting next to you, it's like, this doesn't mean anything to Dan, does it?
Yeah, it does. I actually wrote a whole book about it. Yeah. The last book I wrote, called The Good Atheist, Living a Purpose-Filled Life.
Dan went on to talk about his most recent book, called The Good Atheist, Living a Purpose-Filled Life Without God. He said there may not be a meaning of life, but there is meaning in life. which we find essentially in seeing problems and solving them, trying to make the world a better place. So there is purpose in life. I think Dan sees meaning only emerging from molecules as those molecules become more complex and become functioning human beings. Meaning does not exist as a reified thing in the first place. I tend to see meaning as pre-existing in the universe, in the mind of God. And as molecules become more complex and become functioning human beings, those pre-existing ideas become active.
The way I see it is you're an existentialist. As I understand existentialism, they believe that an existentialist would believe there isn't any set meaning. We find ourselves existing and we have to make our own meaning.
In his debates, Dan makes this very strong argument. He says all you need to do is look at any children's hospital and you know there's no God. Parents are desperately praying for their children and yet they die. How do I reconcile my belief in an ultimately good God with such suffering, such evil? The vast majority of children are not dying in hospitals. That's some consolation. But I know that really doesn't get God off the hook. Is a man a good father if he has many children and beats the crap out of only one or two of them? No, that's not a good father. Dan's right. At least by human standards, if there's a God, he's not a very caring God. But I don't insist on a fully anthropomorphic God who has to follow human standards. Evil may play a necessary role in the greater scheme of things from God's perspective. I don't know. I certainly don't like it. But I still see a non-intervening God who is very tough, yet ultimately benevolent, as more reasonable than a universe with no God and no ultimate meaning. My personal answer to the problem of evil is to posit an afterlife where an infinity of happiness would make even great suffering on earth, by comparison, approach zero. I think that's a plausible theoretical answer, that God will make things right in the end. Although, it's not a particularly satisfying answer because it is so theoretical. And yet that is what I do believe in.
The pragmatic happiness argument. We can't prove or disprove the existence of God, so we might as well believe in God. It's the happier path.
Yeah.
So, say I'm a theist. I would say, describing myself as a theist, I can't prove God. I don't know there's a God. I'm not even convinced there's a God. I just believe it because it makes more sense to me than not. So I would be, I don't know, 75% theist, 25% agnostic. You would be complete opposite, but I don't know what. How sure are you of not God? Like 99% or?
Depends how you define it. If it's the God of the Bible, I'm about almost 100%.
Me
right?
too.
And if it's some other as yet undefined amorphous thing, then I would have to withhold judgment. So you can't say that you have disproved any and all possible definitions. But if atheism is defined as an absence of theism, then I am a 100% atheist because I don't have a belief in a personal God.
Is it a legitimate choice to say, well, I don't know if there's a God, I don't know if there is not a God, I might as well believe. The image that comes to my mind is that we're on a raft. Life is a raft around the ocean. Is there a God? Is there land ahead or not? We don't know. I'm going to believe there is because it's just going to make my life happier.
Yeah, okay. There's nothing stopping anyone from thinking that way. Some of us enjoy the ride on the raft. We think it's great all by itself, even if it never gets anywhere. And some of us think the ride is miserable. I guess we're all different at where we find our happiness. But and atheists aren't going to dictate to believers of any stripe what you can imagine or think or pretend or whatever. I mean, it's a free world and it's a free country.
Yeah.
So some of us might even say it's great that some human beings want to believe in a God and believe in Allah and build their beautiful church. It's great. That's culture. That's human. But some of us want to know, but is there really an Allah back there?
Yeah.
Did Muhammad really have a night flight on the horse over to Jerusalem? Did that really happen or not? And those people believe it, and they feel like their lives are enhanced, and they feel better. Fine, and we're no threat to them. They can believe what they want. But some of us want to know. Some of us actually, is it true or not? We want to know that, even if it's painful. We want the truth. Even if it makes you less happy, we want the truth.
This is again something that I have no idea what you're going to say, or you might find it quite meaningless. But my evidence that God cares. Here's what I interpret as God's evidence that He cares. I think first of all, there is no hard evidence. You can't scientifically prove anything. If you pray for something and then you don't pray for something else, and you keep track of all that, you'll see there's no difference. Okay, so I don't think God intervenes that way. But this is the way where I think certain things can be reasonably interpreted as God caring for us. I'll give you four things that I think. Our species is thriving. Our bodies self-heal usually. Life is intelligible and navigable, as opposed to being a complete crapshoot. And there are many good experiences. I think our body's healing. That to me is some evidence that, God there's some thing, some energy, some live thing that's making us grow from babies to adults and keeping our hearts beating for the rest of our lives, or during our lives. So I interpret those things as God's caring about us, despite the fact that He won't do anything about the Holocaust or the Oklahoma City bombing.
Or malaria, or all sorts of other things. Yeah,
that's the biggest weakness of my position, is the problem of evil.
Yeah, it is a weakness. And those four things that you listed, we could go through them one at a time, but you can also explain all those in purely survivalistic, evolutionary adaptive ways. Weeds and invasive species thrive, and yet we try to get rid of them, right? Mm-hmm. The fact that our species is surviving may not mean much more than that we are a weed in this biosphere that we have taken over because of our adaptive advantages. The second thing, what was the second one?
Self-healing.
Self-healing, yeah, that's pretty amazing. But even that you could still explain in terms of our ancestors who did not self-heal were less likely to survive than those of us who did. So there's an adaptive, and that happens in plants. Plants that are hurt will then heal themselves, and it's not through some. All living
some
things.
Life force of some sort. I choose to interpret as an actual personal intelligence.
Well, maybe. I mean, if there's nothing wrong with that interpretation as long as it's coherent and then it's open to being verified or falsified as well. Yeah. Because it could be falsified when we come to a complete mechanistic understanding of how wounds heal. In fact, don't we have much of that already? Don't we pretty much have an understanding of how...
But then we'd be able to create a human being ourselves, or create life.
We do. When we have sex, you create life.
Well,
two different people, two different human beings are coming together with totally random...
Yeah, but are we creating... I mean, we're doing actions, but isn't it some power that's making that life happen? I mean,
well, when the germ cells recombine, that's something that's happening within your body, your own body, the DNA, all that stuff in the molecules is happening together. So you're doing it, your body's doing it. I mean, who else is doing that? I mean, it's your own biological organism that's doing that. And then what does creation mean if not something like that?
Yeah, but if I got a scratch in my arm and I see it heal over a few days, I don't say to myself, I'm doing that.
No, that's subconscious. That's a biological process.
It's a biological process. There's some, yeah, it is a biological process. So there's some power that makes that happen. That's extraordinary.
But as we've been talking right now, you haven't stopped to say, look, I'm breathing in and out. Look, I'm breathing in and out. It's an autonomic thing that happens. You could stop and say, oh, look, I'm breathing.
Well, okay, it's an automatic thing, but it's an amazing thing.
It's amazing, yeah. It's incredible. It's
and I
fascinating.
puzzled God to explain it.
Well, then what that is basically is the argument from design, basically repackaged as I don't have an explanation, therefore God. It's like when the ancients saw the thunder and the lightning. I don't understand that, therefore Zeus, therefore Thor. But now that we understand the weather...
Okay, we see how it happens. Yeah. So I think the God of the gaps, I think it's very legitimate not to believe in the God of the gaps. You shouldn't say that's because of God directly. You should say this is the scientific explanation for this, and you keep going and going and going. But then when you finally get to the end, then you get a positive God, I think.
Well,
but the final gap is the only one...
But the healing of the wound...
Yeah.
We could be at the stage of our understanding about the healing of wounds, and maybe we're further along than I think, but we could be at a similar stage to where the ancients were when they looked at thunder and lightning. They didn't have an explanation.
Okay.
So, in which case, you would be willing to discard the self-healing of a wound as a evidence for God when we do come to that understanding. When we do come to a pure natural biological understanding of what's going on. And I think we pretty much do have that. I'm not a biologist or a scientist, but I think there's nothing mysterious about what's happening. We see that. We see that. It's amazing, but when a plant heals itself, it's like when a scar heals over. But historically, so far, we've seen all those gaps close. We've seen it.
Yeah, but say that some scientists thousands of years from now have come up with a theory of everything, and so they understand everything, how everything happens, how the universe started and everything, and how bodies heal and everything. They understand that. To me, it's like still you have to posit a God to explain where that came from.
Okay, so then the wound and the self-healing is just an intermediate step in your mind along that way, right?
The life force itself. I mean, why? Whatever happens, whatever the physical process is, can be explained scientifically, I guess. But why it should happen, or I don't know. I just think there's.
Yeah, it's mysterious. But they used to think that about plants. Look at the leaves out that window there. There's green leaves, and photons from the sun are hitting those leaves randomly, and they're hitting atoms and molecules within that leaf, and certain photons are hitting it and exciting an electron to a higher state, and then through this, whatever that process is called, the N-shaped double step through there, something inorganic has become something organic.
I think Dan sees science as explaining ultimately everything, whereas postulating God explains nothing. I see postulating God as explaining ultimately everything, whereas science only keeps explaining how things work, not why they should work.
You had 4 things that you went through, and I think we only went through 2 of them. Remember
that we're thriving, that our body heals usually, that there are good experiences in life.
Yeah.
And, if every bad experience that kind of denies God, problem of evil, there are also good experiences.
Yeah.
And then what was my other? The fact that life is navigable, intelligible. To me, that's evidence that God. But to you, that would be just evidence that life is navigable, not that there's evidence for God, probably.
Yeah. Well, there might be some traction to that, except I think it depends who you are. If you're some poor person living in a developing country where your kids are dying and starving and life is not navigable and life is not good, can those people conclude, therefore there's no God? Usually in those countries, in those situations where things are really bad, is when God belief increases.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not an expert, but I've heard sociologists say that it's kind of like you want some ticket out of the misery. It's like you want to buy that cosmic lottery ticket. So you're praying, you're giving to your church, and you're believing in God, please. And as you pointed out earlier, in countries that are functionally doing very well, like Denmark and Japan and a lot of countries, Sweden, belief in God goes down. So it seems counterintuitive to your argument that the good things in life would make you want to believe more in a God, when in fact the opposite happens. It seems like a God belief is a ticket out of misery. So, and a lot of life is not navigable. A lot of life ends in horrible, you and I are just lucky. Then why call this something other than what it is? Why boot it up to some, why photosynthesis is photosynthesis? Why call it God? Healing is healing. Things are happening, and life is navigable. The tree root is reaching to the. Look at how it gets to the water. And why not just call that a tree? Why complicate reality by adding another word to it that we don't need? That doesn't get us anything.
That means that the universe sort of created itself, and it just that's where our basic difference. I think you got to posit a God to explain all this, whereas you say that all this is just here.
And what's wrong with that?
It makes less sense to me. I would say that might be the case. It's just the universe is just here. That could be the case. I admit that, but it seems more likely to me that there's some power behind it that made it that way.
And so it might seem maybe not more logical, but more intuitive to you to think that way. That intuitively, I think you're right. There's an awful lot of human beings who can't help thinking that way. And there's probably some survival value to that. There probably is. There's probably a good reason why an awful lot of people are religious. Like my daughter Christy, she.
I think I remember you were saying something about that. Yeah. About why she. Yeah, go ahead.
She read my book, Losing Faith in Faith, a few years ago. She's really smart. She's really sweet, and a good mom and a good daughter. And she said, "Dad, I read your book, and it makes perfect sense logically." Yep, I think I can't. There's nothing I can disagree with. Yep, you're a good writer, and it makes sense. And I'm all ready to say, yeah, I'm an atheist too, but I realize that if I do that, I'll never see Grandma again. Her grandma had just died. Mm-hmm. And she said, I'm not ready to kill Grandma. And in other words, in her mind, becoming an atheist would be killing Grandma, because she would lose the hope of seeing this woman that she loved and thinking that she was existing on. And I said to Christy, that actually is a very loving, positive reason you just gave. You love your grandma. You know your grandma. You want to be with her. You want to see her. And there's nothing shameful about feeling that way, your love for humanity. And I'm not going to tell you what to think or believe or not. You were honest about the fact that you don't have any logical reasons. You don't have any good evidences. You agreed that the atheistic arguments are true, but you still have this feeling within you that you don't want to let go of. And I remember that feeling too when my mom died, and Annie Laurie when her dad died. We actually know that was the cessation of a bunch of functioning molecules.
Not the loss of a spirit?
No. I mean, when the ancients would dream about their dead ancestors, Grandma died, but I'm still dreaming about her, so Grandma must live somewhere. You can see how powerful that is, this idea that she's gone, but I can still picture her. I can still hear her voice. I still dream about her, so she must be somewhere.
I don't think of, because I dream of my father or relatives, that they are still alive or still exist. I think it makes sense that they still exist.
Well, maybe somehow, I don't know how that would work, because so far we have no evidence at all
the very first thing, if you're going to posit or think of or theorize an afterlife, the very first thing you do is you have to decide it's not going to be the same as this life. So therefore it's going to be beyond science.
Because when your own brain gets hurt, your consciousness changes. When your own brain gets compromised in some way, your personality changes. When people get old, they get dementia. When our brain is growing and changing in chemicals. Coffee affects our brain in a certain way, and so we do have plenty of evidence of an exquisite dependence of consciousness on the physical brain. We have that evidence. We have no evidence at all that what we call consciousness could exist independent.
The God that I believe in accepts atheists. God that I believe in is not so egotistical as to demand to be believed in. And I know I think of you. I think of my friend Larry is an atheist. God is going to reject him because he's an atheist. That is kind of a very small-minded God. And if God exists, God wants us to behave well, and whether we believe in him or not is pretty irrelevant. And then that's a big argument against Christianity, that the God of the Christian religion is just such a egotistical monster.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Ultimately, I think you're right that people should be judged by their actions, not by their beliefs. And you and I probably agree that we don't care what someone believes as long as their actions are kind and charitable and altruistic and good. I don't think it's most Christians. I think it's the right-wing Christians, and they're noisy, and so we hear from them a lot. I think most Christians actually support state-church separation, but they're just quiet about it. They respect it, and many of them either join our group or become plaintiffs with us because they realize it's important that the government stay neutral. So,
like the swearing on the Bible for the president when he was sworn in. And that you're trying to get rid of that. You're trying to impose your minority viewpoint on the majority. But what you're doing really is trying to keep the minority, to keep the Christians from imposing their viewpoint on everybody else and having this privileged position. I mean, how would they feel if the president had to swear in on a Quran? So, just want to make that point clear. And that brings up the other big thing is in Free Thought Today every month you have the crank mail. That is just so appalling. The stuff that these people write in, and just how, they for people who don't know, they presumably Christians write in and say, why don't you atheists leave the country if you don't like it, and then blankety blank 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 blank, and they go on like that. And it's just their whole mentality is just so appalling and evil and ignorant.
Yeah. Okay. Some of our readers love that page and they go to it first thing. Some of our readers hate the page. They think it's a waste of space, because they know why are we giving space? And I guess it's to document, for one thing, what happens. But we all know and we all admit that those comments do not represent basic Christianity. We know that they represent a small fringe element of angry, right-wing, ignorant people, right? I think that one of the reasons we print that stuff is to show that we are being noticed. And if we weren't getting comments like that, then we would be failing. I mean, we want to work, as you said, for state-church separation, which, to amplify what you said earlier, what we're asking for is neutrality. But there are some believers on the right wing of any faith who can't distinguish between neutrality and hostility. They think if we're asking for the government to back off and be neutral, not promoting or hindering religion, it's actually a hostile attack against their majority
position.
Freedom to promote religion.
I remember one instance when the Freedom from Religion Foundation got a town to take a cross off of public property, and the local lumber yard started doing great business, making wooden crosses, which people put on their own lawns. And the local Christians probably thought, ha, we show those atheists they can't take away our freedom of religious expression. But these people completely missed the point. Freedom from Religion Foundation has no problem with people doing things on their own property, but on public property or at public functions. Opening a school board meeting, for example, with a Christian prayer is not religious freedom, but religious imposition. It is not fair to the non-Christians in the room. Mike Huckabee, Bill O'Reilly, these are two guys who've got lots of good things to say about current affairs, but when it comes to religion, I think they're out to lunch. Huckabee about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, quote, "These dimwits, they call themselves freethinkers who absolutely are against any real freedom they don't agree with. That is such an unfair and distorted understanding of what the Freedom from Religion Foundation is all about." Bill O'Reilly, quote, "Why do some atheists want to ban the Bible from the inauguration? Because they want to impose their belief system upon the rest of us. No, it's because they don't want Christians to impose their belief system upon the rest of us. Why should Christianity be given a preferential position by the government?" The Freedom from Religion Foundation only wants to impose fairness. They do admittedly want to promote atheism or humanism as a better worldview than religion, but by promoting it, not by imposing it.
What I think the bottom line is, let's see what you react to this. You see the problem of evil and no evidence of God as compelling reason to be an atheist. Whereas I, despite the lack of hard evidence, see an ultimate intelligence behind the world as making more sense than a world just being here by chance. And people can decide for themselves which of these two perspectives makes more sense to them. The greater priority is just behave well.
Yeah, I agree. You and I both agree on morality, I think, and on basic humanistic principles and on fairness and all these human things. We disagree on the question of a God, and we each think the other is wrong, and we're free to say so. And that's part of the dialogue, I guess. And I think, and there's probably some exceptions, but I think most atheists don't care. We're live and let live. We don't care what people think. There might be a few atheists over here who were barging into churches or something, but we're not. We're not interrupting church meetings, and we're not trying to interfere with people's private freedom.